Good morning, everyone. We're here for our virtual meeting of Wise Women. We know you're all home or at some other remote location, and we'll try to think of you all here together so we can all enjoy today's presentation by Mr. Harold Bailey, who most of you probably know from Team Westport. He has a long and distinguished career in many different areas, but he'll be speaking with us today about Team Westport and in particular about issues of racial equity. So we all look forward to what he has to say, and please join me in welcoming him. And also, we welcome questions from you. You can email, there'll be an email address or at the bottom of the screen that you can email to us. So, two people applauding here. Thank you, Harold.
That's more applause than I get at home anyway. So, thank you very much. I appreciate that, Margaret. Look, I really appreciate the time this morning to be able to spend with you to talk about some of the issues that are really at the forefront of the racial reckoning that is going on at this period of time. And of course, we can't forget the backdrop of what is going on nationally right now and the impact that may or may not have on that reckoning taking place and some progress continuing to be made. What I want to do this morning is first do just a little bit of an overview of some of the operating principles that, what is Team Westport, what are some of the operating principles that we're going by, and then quickly get into a narrative about just an exercise that'll get us into looking at our common narrative and making sure we're on the same page there, and then moving into some of the topics currently that are prominent in terms of racial reckoning within the country. So let's start by my telling you a little bit about Team Westport, and I mean very little because I want to focus on history and issues this morning. Team Westport is the town's committee that's responsible for making Westport increasingly welcoming with respect to race, religion, ethnicity, and LGBTQI issues. We have been in place as a selectmen's committee. We were in place from the middle of 2003 until 2005. And then in 2005, we became an official town committee commissioned on this mission I just mentioned by the RTM. While we've gone through ups and downs in terms of membership and how many we've had and so on, currently one of the really impressive things that's going on is that, I'd say for the last 4 years, we've had representation from all major organizations, or let's say the majority of the major organizations inside town. And so whether it's the library or the playhouse or the police or the school system or the Board of Education or the Westport Museum of History as an example, or the interfaith clergy, the interfaith council. We have people from higher education who are on committee. When we sit down once a month, we're talking about issues surrounding that mission I talked about, but with all those folks involved. In addition, within the last 2 years, we've had training of every one of those organizations or the leaders of those organizations with respect to some of the principles surrounding anti-racism. And I'll get into what we're talking about there. But just think about this. When we say anti-racism, what we're saying is really the proactive dismantling of racial disparities in any one of the arenas that I just mentioned. And that's what anti-racism really is. There's nothing, by the way, political. There's nothing terroristic. There's nothing anti-American about it. In fact, it should be, if we're talking about American ideals, one of the most American things you can undertake as a citizen. So what are those principles that we operate by? Principles include, the principles are primarily the ones from Ibram Kendi. Ibram Kendi, as many of you may know, has become something of an icon since the George Floyd incident. He's got 3 bestsellers on the New York Times bestseller list. He's actually had an episode of Oprah that's been dedicated just to his work. And he was here in Westport about 2 years ago as our MLK speaker. We were so impressed by what we heard that, and when I say we, I mean members of Team Westport, heads of the interfaith clergy and so on, that we asked him to come back to do some training for us. This is before he was this national icon. And he ran a center that was focused on anti-racism out of American University. So he actually helped a couple of years ago train some of our key leaders in these different organizations. And it was training not just about what are the basics of anti-racism, but one of the primary objectives was to put in place programs inside of your own organization to start to move in that direction, and that dismantling of disparities. So what are some of the principles? One is that in any group, certainly a group the size of black people in the United States versus white people in the United States, in any one of those groups, there should be the same per person capability for people who are smart, people who are funny, people who are dull, people who are average, people who are really good at economics, people who are really going to be good at sports, people who are going to be good at anything. There should be some equivalence when you've got groups that large. And the truth is, there should be no superiority of one group as a group over another group as a group. So if there are disparities between those groups that show up in the numbers, in wealth, in education, in some other areas, then you don't look at the people to blame the people for the disparities. You look at the policies that help shape those disparities. So it's policies, not people. The next principle is there is no such thing as a racist person or an anti-racist person. What we're talking about there generally is there are racist actions and ideas, and there can be racist policies, but there are also anti-racist ones. And in effect, the same person can 1 minute have an anti-racist idea in terms of thinking about doing something or taking an action that moves the ball towards dismantling of a negative meme or a racist idea about a group, and 5 minutes later have another idea that moves in the other direction, where they might say, oh my God, I'm afraid because that person's walking towards me and he looks like someone who may be dangerous, as an example. So what really is going on here is a constant battle back and forth of what I like to call racial hygiene, where you're looking at it, the whole idea is to try to have the net of your thoughts and your actions to be towards the area of dismantling racism, as opposed to towards the area of continuing to perpetuate the poison that has been in our minds and hearts really since 1619. The other thing is in terms of the movement. We talk about progress in this country, and we like to say America is always progressing. We're not there yet, and there's this great ideal, but we're moving, and we're always moving in the direction of progress. The truth is, there are two very strong forces going on at the same time. And as we'll see in a sec, as much as we move in the direction of progress and bending the arc of justice towards, the arc of history towards justice for this country, there's an alternative force that's going on at the same time that moves us back in the other direction. And that's been going on historically here in the United States. So again, we need to be aware of the fact and not get discouraged when we have forward movement, but then there will be periods when it looks like things are moving backwards. There has to be the vision to persevere towards moving in the right direction. Okay, the other one, just in terms of racist people, we talked about equity and so on. Those are the primary principles that we are dealing with. There was a slide I would have shown you, which was to show the difference between equity and equality. Equality says, in effect, everybody gets the same thing. Equity says everybody gets what they need. And it's easy to show that by having people who are different heights. One person could be 6 feet, one could be 4 feet tall, the other person could be 3 feet tall, and we have a fence there that's 5 feet tall. The person who's 6 feet tall is already in good shape. And so if what we do is to give them a stool, the same stool that we give the other folks, let's say the same stool that we gave the person who was 3 feet tall, they're way above the fence, they're way above the hurdle. The other person is just barely able to get to look over that fence. The other one's a little bit more. Equity says, in effect, we want them all to have that same view over the fence at the same height and to be advantaged equally, which is really what our ideals as a country are all about. So, one of the things I'd like to do now is to kind of switch gears. And let's take go through an exercise. And I'm going to ask for this to get, well, in order for this to get personal and to have some meaning, I'm going to ask you to think about something here. Picture a person that you love dearly. This is someone who is extremely close to you. And I like to say the person you care about most in the world. They're kidnapped. And they're kidnapped and taken to another country. And they're taken to that country where the kidnapper says they are his property. They're forced into labor. And they're living with the prospect of beatings if they don't produce daily, torture if they don't produce over the long haul, and that torture can happen daily. The real fear that they might have is that they could be actually brutally tortured, they could be maimed if they speak their native tongue, or if they try to learn this new language in a country where they are. They have to just produce, and there can't be any evidence of trying to escape. There's a constant threat of some kind of abuse, which could include sexual abuse, since their bodies are no longer their own, their property. Now, let's imagine that you're able to rescue them after a year, 2 years, or maybe even sooner. What would you think the kidnappers owed you? And what would you think the complicit country that said this was okay might owe you as well? And what actions would you take to get some kind of restitution? Now, suppose you were not able to find them after a year, 2 years, 10 years, ever. They have children, and the children die in the same, they die and the children are in the same situation that they are, with whoever, quote, owns them, saying that they're their owners, and the owners of their children, and the owners of the children after that. So the children are property of the kidnappers, and they can sell them at will. And the children have children, and so on. That is exactly what happened in the United States. But not just to one person, not just to thousands of people, but to millions of people. And it was even worse than that, because the kidnapping was not on a nice ship or even in a container where you're all locked up in a container and you end up getting there, but in a ship where major high percentages of the people that were taken from Africa to the United States perished. And in fact, that was part of the equation in the numbers that could be held on any ship. So for 2.5 centuries, the United States nationally sanctioned that kidnapping, that brutalization, that terrorism of these people. And these are people. We like to use the term slaves. That's another way of putting people off into the category of things almost. They were enslaved people. Why was it tolerated? It was tolerated for profit. It was tolerated for the profits surrounding cotton at the time, which was actually more valuable than gold. And how was it tolerated? it was tolerated by one big lie. And that lie is that these people were not really human. They were certainly not human at the level of the people that had brought them here to the United States. And they were destined for bondage by God. So religion got involved. And religion also said the labor that they endured, which was sun up to sundown, with daily beatings if you did not end up at the top of the list of the folks who were bringing in cotton from the fields, that purified their souls. We went through this in this country from 1619 until we had a constitution around the 1780s. And during that period of time, the memes were put in place, the thoughts about these people, who they were, what they were. And so when the Constitution was formed, I would say the very first example of systemic racism was declaring that these people were 3/5 of a human being, codifying that. From 1820 to 1860, this is shortly after the introduction of the cotton gin, the United States went from an agrarian economy to one of the fastest growing economies the world had ever seen. In fact, at that time, it was the fastest growth any economy had ever seen. Kind of with Wall Street as a center, financing it, and with the combinations of Southern slaveholders and then some of the Northern businesses that were associated with the introduction of slavery and the manufacture and the picking of cotton and then the manufacturing of cloth out of it, the United States had an incredible GDP growth. It's estimated that 40% of GDP growth was directly related to the people who were enslaved. So these people that built the country, that worked sun up to sundown, were called lazy. These people that were tortured if they read or were deemed incapable of learning. These people that had skilled labor, and in fact served as the bulk of the skilled labor here in the United States, including in New England, by the way, these people built the White House. They built mansions all over this country. They built roads. They built university buildings. They were called ape-like. The bottom line really is, without the talent and sacrifice of these people, America as we know it would not exist today. And the truth is also that if we're going to use this term, they were America's original wealth creators. Then in 1865, after 250 years, or 240 years of this, all of a sudden these folks were freed. But they were free and told they were on their own, in effect. It was also a time when, after that happened, when we ended up after the Civil War with Confederates returning home, and there being some tremendous massacres of people. We went into the area of the beginning of Reconstruction in this country, and that was a major inflection point. Although people were freed, would they get resources? Would they get education? Would they get any kind of compensation for the work that had been done, for that contribution to the GDP over the last 200 plus years? And the original response was, you're really basically on your own, but as the Southerners came back, some of the Confederates came back after the war, even though there was a strong bent inside of Congress and inside from the United States government to try to do something to compensate people. There was a 40-acre and a mule initiative that got started and then quickly stopped. One of the reactions that happened around 1865, around 1866, was that in places like Memphis and Louisiana, there were massive lynchings and murders of African Americans. In fact, in one Louisiana town, the black vote was such that people had actually been able to elect new leaders who were part of a party, the Republican Party at that time, who were going to take over the town versus those who were traditionally Democratic, who were the Confederates. A great number of black people and others gathered in the courthouse in order to protect this new government and let it be seated. And what happened was it was surrounded by the Klan, and the entire courthouse was burned down. That and a number of other incidents led the federal government to immediately institute a number of amendments that happened over between 1866, 1865, and 1870, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Now, the 13th Amendment said, it was the official constitutional end to legalize slavery in the United States. But there was one caveat we'll talk about in a second. The 14th said, full citizenship and equal protection under the law should be extended to everyone, including those who had been formerly enslaved people in the country. So there should be equal citizenship and equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment said, this is your right to vote, and your right to vote as a citizen extended to black men, just as it extended to white men in this country. And so the 15th Amendment was the first foray into voting rights for people who had been enslaved. Now, we then went on into the area of Reconstruction, and in Reconstruction, the question is, how are these new rights actually going to be exercised? The truth is, there were some major gains, and this was one of the first inflection points for the country. We had really high hopes. Between 1863 and 1877, there were 2 black senators, there were 15 congressmen, 1 governor, and 15 legislators. They were all enabled by federal occupation that took place, but there was tremendous belief that the country was moving in the right direction, and there were some major steps being taken. Of course, all of that came to an end in 1877 with the Hayes-Tilden situation. And all of the federal relief, the federal troops were removed. So the question is, what happened as a result? What happened as a result was that with that protection removed, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments had various interpretations by the Supreme Court and others. Let's take a look at what happened. The 13th Amendment had a caveat in it that said slavery and involuntary servitude could be removed except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. In other words, it was okay to utilize people in an enslaved manner, provided they were imprisoned. What happened out of that was just a raft of laws being passed at the local level, at the state level, in southern states that were the black codes, that said basically, if you didn't work for somebody, then you were a vagrant. If you were a vagrant, you had broken the law and you could be imprisoned. Once you were imprisoned, there were chain gangs which could be utilized by some of the same families that had enslaved people before, and with no compensation, obviously, for the people that were part of that chain gang. And that is kind of the first foray that happened out of the black codes. Sharecropping was another thing that happened, because it said, in effect, if you're down here, then you've got to work for somebody, and you're going to work for them at whatever the rate is that they say you need to work for them. And in effect, if you don't, you're going to become a vagrant. So we had sharecropping and convict leasing that took place all through the South. That's what happened with the 13th Amendment. The 14th Amendment was one in which, even though the amendment had said that everyone had full citizenship and full protection under the law, the Supreme Court's interpretation was, with cases like Plessy versus Ferguson, that was never strictly, literally meant. That it would be okay to have, as long as we had separate, quote, but equal, different rights, separate but equal facilities, that we'd be living up to the letter of the law. And of course, that led to legal and de facto segregation throughout the United States for the next 100 years. And the 15th Amendment was for voting rights. And the answer again from the Supreme Court was, well, they're voting rights, but those voting rights are kind of left up to the states. So if the states individually or locally want to have poll taxes or other kinds of, or some kind of a test that you've got to take, and that's a requirement, that's okay. So basically, there was a punt at the federal level to kick this back down to the local levels. The bottom line was, with all of this done, we had two very different lives, two different sets of lived experiences between white citizens of this country and black citizens. And the bottom line overall for the South was that there was full control by former Confederates and their heirs over the lives of black people that they had historically terrorized legally. And we ended up, for much of that 100-year period after the Civil War, with terrorism, lynching, the emergence of the KKK, some significant steps backward from some of the gains that had been made during Reconstruction even. And one of the things that happened during that period was also redlining. I'll move forward and say that we got to the Civil Rights era, and in effect, what happened was there were obviously some major changes that happened. Again, this is another inflection point. Public accommodation laws, the Voting Rights Act that took place, affordable housing laws, that were not just affordable, but housing laws, period, that took place inside of the country. And again, when we take a look at affirmative action that was put in place, for a while, that was put in place because in terms of the public culture and the public attitude, as well as the laws that had been in place, what had been said for the last 100 years was that what had been said for the 250 years before that, which is in effect, black people are not the same as white people. They're less human, they're less educable, they're less capable. And so affirmative action was put in place basically to say, if I can deliver people who have exactly the same capabilities, and the job actually gets down to those two people, one white, one black, I'm going to give the job to the black person up to a certain point. By the way, it was always up to a certain point, to try to turn around that poison, to try to take some step to undo what had been done before. But by the 1980s, that had become turned around to via terms like reverse racism and attitudes like little memes like political correctness. And so we moved away from the work that had been done, that some of those things that had happened, and the inflection point kind of receded. We ended up with, in the 90s, unprecedented levels of incarceration, with black men being incarcerated at 5 to 6 times the level of white men. And of course, a lot of that continues to today. And then there was, of course, the militarism that took place as well. Well, and then I'm just going to bring it up to today, where we can talk about the situation that's taken place that took place this year with George Floyd. As I mentioned, we have, as a town, been in place, had Team Westport in place since for the last 17 years. And the truth is, for the past 5 years, we have been talking about a number of these issues with leadership here in town on an ongoing basis, certainly on a monthly basis at least. And for the last 2 years, we had been working, having had a good deal of the training and the direction from Ibram Kendi's organization. But at this point, on a national basis, since the George Floyd incident, all of a sudden there's been tremendous attention to try to look at what's happened. It's like white America's awakened to the fact that we really have had a dichotomy in our lived experiences between black experiences and white experiences in this country. In terms of what's happened for black people as a result of this, it's like we can finally reveal the fact that whenever something's been said like, the policeman is your friend, that's had a double meaning for black people in this country. That in black neighborhoods, the police have not been in place necessarily to protect and to comfort. There's been more of an intimidation factor in black neighborhoods, certainly in urban areas, most urban areas in this country, which would be very different from the experience for citizens who lived in the suburbs, as an example, and looked at the police. So being able to talk about those dichotomies, being able to talk about those differences is something that's opened up all of a sudden. And it's really exciting that so many young people, so many young white people have been excited enough to come out and demonstrate to try to get this finally resolved and reckoned with. In terms of prominent topics to be dealt with since that started, let's first do some of the basics of conscious bias, unconscious bias, microaggressions. You might hear those terms thrown around, whether it's with the teen diversity essay contests or in some other areas that you've run into. What are we talking about? With conscious bias, what we're saying is that someone can consciously go out and do something that sets the ball backwards. Conscious bias is anything from random phone calls, which can be made, that put black lives at risk. So someone makes a phone call because they don't think you belong in a situation. And you may have heard it through memes like guilty of being black while studying in your own dormitory, being guilty of being black by trying to walk into your own house, which is one of the things that was in the news some 8 years ago. That kind of conscious randomness where someone can have the police involved and that can lead to a tragedy is one of the conscious bias pieces. And of course, there's the murder without accountability, which can happen, as in the George, which has happened with a number of folks and was really just came to the fore with the George Floyd situation, even though there's appeared to be some accountability happening there at this time, certainly in process. Unconscious bias, on the other hand, is where there is just, without anyone knowing or consciously thinking about bias, they say two candidates, this one looks like, for instance, if I'm looking for a doctor, this one looks like a doctor, that one doesn't look to me like a doctor. And the major determinant between that has to be the racial appearance of one versus the other. So a person walks into a situation and they have to dig out of a negative assumption that's out there from other people about who they are and what their capabilities are. That's unconscious bias. And microaggressions are kind of the backhanded comments and the backhanded actions that can be taken by someone, such as a teacher giving a Latinx student who speaks English perfectly well, I'll say that, a package for undocumented financial aid, and undocumented students to apply for financial aid, students feeling the hair of black students, white students doing that. And it can range from that to students using the N-word. It can also be parents, as an example, wearing afro wigs at Halloween and thinking it's really cool. These are white parents and wearing black or brown face. Those are the little slights that build up over time that have made life very different for black people and people of color than whites. So one of the things that we're talking about prominent topics, one of the first ones is Black Lives Matter. And I often say the term Black Lives Matter would normally be Black Lives Matter too. But I think it was really important for the people putting the statement together that the two takes away from the power. It is an affirmative statement. It is an affirmation that just as much as the lives of policemen who are blue lives and the lives of white people, black lives matter just as much as theirs. And if you want to see how the two takes it away, When somebody says, this is my country, that's one statement. When they say, this is my country too, you go, too, wait a minute, does that mean, is there some reason why this wouldn't be your country, or I should think it's not your country? And it's that kind of a difference. But the bottom line is that in terms of that statement, this is a statement of humanity. And it says, based on our ideals, or the ideals of humanity, a black life is worth as much as a white life, is worth as much as a blue life. And that matter of humanity is something that is not political. It can't be. If it's political, what it says is it's debatable. And if it's debatable, it says we're willing as a country or as a group or as a human or as an individual to debate whether or not a black life is as important as one of those other lives. There is nothing political, there is nothing debatable about my humanity or your humanity or anyone else's in this country. And so that Black Lives Matter affirmation, while it might seem obvious, it should be taken to heart for that reason. There is the issue about policing in this country. And policing, historically, kind of goes back to the time of the slave patrols in the United States. The idea of slave patrols were that legally people could be deputized as police to take escaped enslaved people and then return them to the South. They were paid bounties to do it, pretty much the way bounty hunters still exist today. And a good deal of the whole idea of the slave patrols and then police afterwards in northern territories was not to protect black people so much as to keep black people away from white people and white communities inside of urban areas, as an example. Today, what we've got is not just that culture and the way it's evolved, but also a level of militarism that wasn't there, I'd say, some 30, 40 years ago. And so everything from the stop and frisk situation to the massive continuation of incarceration of black people at levels that are just off the charts. We're the most incarcerating country in the world right now by far, in great part because of the way black people are being incarcerated in the United States or have been historically. So the whole idea about that, and we talk about blue lives mattering, the point is blue lives actually do matter legally more than anyone's. They matter more than white lives from the legal point of view because of the issue of qualified immunity, which says that the assumption in a case where there is a tragedy, where the police have shot someone, gives the police the benefit of a doubt. And I'm not saying that the police shouldn't have that benefit of a doubt by any means, but there does have to be some balance of accountability. And if you go back and you look at the killings, the situations where black people have been killed, it's very rare to find a situation where that accountability has taken place historically. Now, we have the new policing law here in Connecticut, and some of the details of that, some of the ways it's going to work, are still being worked out. But qualified immunity has now been taken off the table as a given here in Connecticut. We're the first state to actually do that to the level that it's been done. And that's a move forward. There are ways to have accountability without this blanket immunity that was there before. And we're going to have to work that out here in this state, and we'll be leading that in the nation. That's part of what I hope Westport and what some of the leadership that's been shown here with the police force is going to be able to lead the way on here, not only in Connecticut, but in the country. And I think we've got a tremendous chief and a great force here to make that happen. And that's very much a part of what we're working on. Another area is people say, I don't see color. I don't care whether you're black, green, red, or whatever, I don't see color. Now, right off the bat, that's logically crazy. That's senseless. If I'm 6 feet tall and I'm walking through a 4-foot opening, if I continue to just walk into the wall and bump into it trying to get through that 4-foot opening, you're going to say I'm crazy. and I would be. So why wouldn't I notice if a person is black, or a person is Asian American, or a person has some other characteristic that's visually different from another person's? And why wouldn't I look at that? Why wouldn't I recognize it? Why wouldn't I celebrate it? And so logically it makes no sense. But the other side of it is that in terms of what it does, when we say, I'm not looking at anything, I'm not looking at race at all, in effect it says, what I have are normal people and then other people. The normal people are those people over here, and the other people are the black people, the Asian American people, the people that are indigenous, maybe those people that look a different way. And in effect, what I've got is a de facto way of saying that white is normal and everything else is not. You could utilize the same thing for mainstream religion versus those that are not in the mainstream. You can look at the same way for people who are heterosexual versus people that are LGBTQI. So we've got to get away from this not identifying each group and say, in effect, that whiteness has to be something that is owned. And it's absolutely critical to be able to sit down and start to talk about what needs to be done to dismantle the disparity. So when we talk about, quote, white people and a white group, it is not to go beat anybody up. It is to say they're white people, they're black people, they're Asian American people, they're these other people. We have to talk about how each one of those groups is treated and what the culture says about them to be able to dismantle the individual disparities so we can all get to the point where we can say we are not just all Americans, but we are all Americans being treated equally and operating with the same rule book. Now, the other thing, several other things, and then I'll stop for some questioning. One of the things that came up recently was, why does Westport look the way it does? And we have to go back to not just Westport, but to Bridgeport, to Stamford, to New York City, to Baltimore, to DC, to just about every major urban area, as well as our suburban areas in this country. In fact, we recently had someone on one of our discussions who mentioned the term zip code apartheid, which is what exists here in Connecticut, where you'll have an urban area that's got whatever problems are there for it, that's very different in terms of the average earnings, in terms of the infrastructure for education and so on, that's extremely different from the little town that's right next to it that might have very high average earnings and tremendous facilities. So how did that happen? In the 1930s and 40s and 50s, all the way up until we had some of the fair housing laws in effect, the United States federal government actually was the one that enforced redlining. And redlining said, in effect, that if there was a single African American that was going to be given a loan for a development, then the federal government would not provide the funding for that loan. That was the net of what the redlining was all about. And there were certain lines that were put together that said these are good communities, and that there were some other color lines that said these are okay communities. At the bottom of the list were the ones that had the red lines around them. So redlining happened, and that's one of the reasons why we have black communities that are, quote, were called the ghettos in the 1960s and the 1970s and so on. And then we have suburban communities that tended to be white. In addition to that, here in Westport and in the whole United States, there were restrictive covenants put on properties so that it could say, I don't want to have any blacks, any Jews, et cetera, who were in this area, on this particular property that were legal. And there were all kinds of other ordinances put in place with certain restrictions on zones inside of this town and other towns across the country. The approach right now is that we're working on is to try to get rid of a number of those restrictions that are out there that really evolved as a result of what was driven by the federal government with redlining in the first place. But one of the things that hurts with what happened with this history of redlining is where there might have been, as an example, a much more diverse set of people who were here many decades before now, who would have been in Westport, would have been in other places. That wasn't even legally possible to happen. And because it didn't happen, we've got generations of wealth that have been built up here in Westport and all over the country with real estate. We've also got a disparity in the real estate that might be equivalent between a black community and a white community. The same house, the same caliber of property will have a significant differential in terms of its market value. So there's all those factors that get folded in. And so one of the things we're trying to do is to get to the point where, again, we get rid of some of those disparities. And that's one of the things we're working on here in the United States, here in Westport, with respect to affordable housing. Now, affordable housing doesn't mean that everybody coming in is going to be of color. Affordable housing doesn't mean that anybody coming in is going to be of color. But it does say that we've got an opportunity there for more people at a different economic strata to be able to come into town. And the odds are higher that we're going to get people that are much more, where we'll have much more diversity in the folks that are coming into town. I'm going to let it go there and say we've got schools, we've got other things that we're working on here in Westport, but let me just net out by saying that our goal has got to be that we see each other as human beings. And what that means is that as we sit down to look at policies versus people, as I talked about before, that we embrace the realities of the past to acknowledge and resolve racist policies, racist narratives, and ideas, such that we emerge with a transformed national vision for going forward. And that vision has to be built upon a transformed understanding and resolution of our common past. We've got a number of vehicles of engagement that we're putting together with as Team Westport and working with all the town organizations. And you're going to see a number of those continue to be rolled out, everything from lectures to conversations to actual initiatives where you can get directly involved in taking a look at what's inside you in terms of ideas, and so that they can inform your actions in an anti-racist direction. And we look forward to making that happen. So I'm open now to any questions that might exist.
Thank you so much, Harold. That was very interesting and very informative. We have a number of questions here. I'll start with the first one, which concerns Team Westport. And it's really a two-part question. Are there similar organizations in other towns and states? And if so, does Team Westport work with them? And are there specific things we maybe want to adopt that they've had success with, or failures we want to avoid? What can we learn from those kinds of organizations?
Well, we don't want to be self-centered, but I will tell you, we have been looking for other organizations in the state that are like this. And to our knowledge, we haven't found any. Certainly not any with the longevity that we've had here in Westport. And so what we're trying to do is to get other towns to adopt the same posture of having folks sit around the table with the model that we've established. Team Weston is an example. Weston is just starting to get off the ground with its own organization, and they're using us as a model. And I've been working certainly in an advisory capacity with them to get that going. What we hope to do is to take the Team Westport model in the state at least and try to get more attention around it so that we can get other places to adopt. But to our knowledge, certainly around here, there hasn't been anything like this on a regular basis.
Okay. Our second question concerns some of the very visible successes we've had with a couple of African Americans, specifically Barack Obama and Kamala Harris. We're certainly happy to see them in the positions Kamala coming up and Barack who had that. Do you think that people sometimes get complacent when they look at, I mean, the general society I'm talking about, look at success like that and say, oh, well, we've gotten rid of all the racial barriers. We have a past president and an upcoming vice president. We don't need to worry about it anymore.
Yeah, I mean, just if you want the best answer to that one, it's take a look at what happened after Barack Obama finished being president. Barack Obama came into to office, and all of a sudden there was this euphoria that led us to think we were, quote, post-racial. The truth is we had never gotten back to acknowledging the history that drove the disparities here in this country, the big lie, which is that black people are less than human, that over the last 400 years has been perpetuated. And so while it's neat to have a leader who looked like Obama, we had a Congress, certainly with Mitch McConnell and others, that was trying to move in the direction of saying that if he could have brought some resolution of that reckoning to the table, they were going to fight against it to make it stop, and they were relatively successful. And then what happened after that? The nation moved in the negative direction, in the opposite direction, at a speed that was absolutely astounding, I think, and certainly extremely disappointing. Disappointing isn't even the word for black people, I think, and people of color in this country. It was astounding. It was so open and so blatant that it really gave some pause as to where the country actually was and what its values were. I think, yeah, we've moved now back into having Kamala Harris as part of the, as vice president, and that's interesting, but this show is not over. We don't know where we're going to go from here. This is another inflection point, and what is going to make a difference is what happens in the next 8 years, 10 years, 12 years. What do we do to take advantage of this? And do we just do people get tired of it again? White people get tired of doing it, and we end up with more moving back in that other direction like we have for the last 4 years? Or do we actually move forward to get this set of disparities resolved? And I have to say also that in terms of, a lot of people ask, well, isn't this just about black people? What about poverty? What about anti-Semitism? What about women? What about the disabled? What about? The truth is, if you take a look at the way the caste system is set up here in the United States, and Isabel Wilkerson talks about this beautifully in her new book, Caste, black people are at the bottom in terms of cultural recognition and cultural respect. And almost any one of the elements of those other areas that you mentioned, there's something, you can be white and you can be disabled. You can be a white woman. You can be gay and you can be white, as an example. And I'm not saying that, I'm not trying to pit anti-Semitism against racism here, but there can be an element of your being invisible if you are Jewish, so that it's not visible necessarily. And the truth is, if we take a look at the template of solving the problem with black people in this country, that can be applied to every one of those other isms. And it's going to move us forward as a country for how to eliminate every one of those. So when we talk about facing this, we're talking about facing all of these disparities in all of these areas for everyone. And there is the flip side of this is it's not just for the people that are being marginalized, it's for the people that are doing the marginalization, which is all of us in every one of those areas that we're helping. And we're making this a healthier, more sustainable society over the long term by doing that.
Okay. Our next question concerns a trip that I believe was planned by Team Westport back in the spring, talking about going to Montgomery in October. Obviously, that couldn't happen this year because of COVID. Do you think that trip will happen at a later time? And if so, how can we find out about it?
Yeah, we had planned to go to the equal, down to Montgomery, Alabama, to the Equal Justice Initiative headquarters down there. That's Brian Stevenson's group down there. And we had planned to be there actually about a month ago. And because of COVID, we couldn't make that happen. And when I say we, I'm talking about some of the interfaith clergy, some of the members of that, including Rabbi Friedman, Reverend Allison Patton, and others that were involved with us in planning this and moving forward on it. So what we're going to do now is take a look, and as soon as things open up, we're going to take that trip. But Bernstein and I have been down to see the museum and then see the memorial to lynchings that took place in this country. And you can say, well, why? My goodness, why do I want to go see that? What's the point? You need to understand, as citizens, we need to understand the history that took place, that parallel train I was talking about running in the opposite direction. It was visibly made clear to all people in this country, certainly to black people, for decades, in the late 1800s into the early 1900s, via the lynchings that took place, not only in the South, but they took place in Illinois, Missouri, they took place in New York, they took place in Ohio, all over the country. The fact that the culture had actually gotten to that point where people would gather by the thousands to watch someone being burned to death or rendered and torn apart, or that in some cases the lynchings were just a group of white people decided that they were upset at things going on in town and decided to identify someone to kill. Or someone was identified and the guy was lynched and his wife decided that she was going to object to it, and then she was lynched along with him for objecting. There were just some horrible things that took place with no accountability in this country. And when you go to that memorial where there is one plaque for each county where a lynching took place, there's not one plaque for each person, or it would take half the town of Montgomery probably. And you take a look at it and just look at the magnitude at what had happened, you get some sense of the hole we're going to have to dig out of in order to get things reconciled in this country. And it's very important. It can really leave you chastened. So anyway, we'll be, as soon as we're able to get that set up, we'll have it done. And we'll be in touch.
Okay, well, actually, we are out of time, so I guess that was a good way to end, and we'll look forward to that trip. And thank you so much, Harold. It was really very interesting and enlightening, and I hope everyone at home enjoyed that.
Thank you.